one of the possible titles you were thinking about originally for the book is The Hard Problem of Life, sort of reminiscent of the hard problem of consciousness. So you're saying that assembly theory is supposed to be answering the question about what is life. So let's go to the other hard problems. You also say that's the easiest of the hard problems is the hard problem of life.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think is the nature of intelligence and consciousness? Do you think something like assembly theory can help us understand that?
I think if assembly theory is an accurate depiction of the physics of life, it should shed a lot of light on those problems. And in fact, I sometimes wonder if the problems of consciousness and intelligence are at all different than the problem of life generally. And I'm of two minds of it, but I in general try to, like the process of my thinking is trying to regularize everything into one theory. So pretty much every interaction I have is like, oh, how do I fold that into? And so I'm just building this giant abstraction that's basically trying to take every piece of data I've ever gotten in my brain into a theory of what life is. And consciousness and intelligence are obviously some of the most interesting things that life has manifest. And so I think they're very telling about some of the deeper features about the nature of life.
It does seem like they're all flavors of the same thing, but it's interesting to wonder, like, at which stage does something that we would recognize as life in a sort of canonical, silly human way, and something that we would recognize as intelligence, at which stage does that emerge? Like, at which assembly index does that emerge, and at which assembly index is a consciousness? Something that we would canonically recognize as consciousness.
Is this the use, like this use of flavors, the same as you meant when you were talking about flavors of alien like alien life?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's the same as the flavors of ice cream and the flavors of fashion.
Yeah, but we were talking about in terms of colors and very nondescript, but the way that you just talked about flavors now was more in the space of consciousness and intelligence. It was kind of much more specific.
It'd be nice if there's a formal way of expressing
quantifying flavors.
quantifying flavors.
Yeah.
It seems like I would order it life, consciousness, intelligence probably as the order in which things emerge, and they're all just the same.
They're the same.
We're using the word life differently here. I mean, life sort of, when I'm talking about what is a living versus a non-living thing at a bar with a person, I'm already like 4 or 5 drinks in, that kind of thing.
Just that.
Like we're not being too philosophical. Like, here's the thing that moves and here's the thing that doesn't move. And but maybe consciousness precedes that. It's a weird dance there. With is life precede consciousness or consciousness precede life? And I think that understanding of what life is in the way you're doing will help us disentangle that.
Depending on what you want to explain, as I was saying before, you have to assume something's fundamental. And so because people can't explain consciousness, there's a temptation for some people to want to take consciousness as fundamental and assume everything else is derived out of that. And then you get some people that want to assume consciousness preceded life. And I don't find either of those views particularly illuminating. I think because I don't want to assume a phenomenology before I explain a thing. And so what I've tried really hard to do is not assume that I think life is anything, except hold on to sort of the patterns and structures that seem to be the sort of consistent ways that we talk about this thing, and then try to build a physics that describes that. And I think that's a really different approach than saying, consciousness is this thing, we all feel and experience about things. I would want to understand the regularities associated with that and build a deeper structure underneath that and build into it. I wouldn't want to assume that thing and that I understand that thing, which is usually how I see people talk about it.
The difference between life and consciousness.
Yeah.
Which comes first?
Yeah. So I think if you're thinking about this sort of thinking about living things as these giant causal structures or these objects that are deep in time or whatever language we end up using to describe it, it seems to me that consciousness is about the fact that we have a conscious experience is because we are these temporally extended objects. So consciousness and the abstraction that we have in our minds is actually a manifestation of all the time that's rolled up in us. And it's just because we're so huge that we have this very large inner space that we're experiencing that's not, and it's also separated off from the rest of the world because we're this separate thread in time. And so our consciousness is not exactly shared with anything else because nothing else occupies the same part of time that we occupy. But I can understand something about you maybe being conscious because you and I didn't separate that far in the past in terms of our causal histories. So in some sense, we can even share experiences with each other through language because of that sort of overlap in our structure.
Well, then if consciousness is merely temporal separateness, then that comes before life.
It's not merely temporal separateness. It's about the depth in that time. So it's
yes.
the reason that my conscious experience is not the same as yours is because we're separated in time. The fact that I have a conscious experience is because I'm an object that's super deep in time. So I'm huge in time. And that means that there's a lot there that I am basically, in some sense, a universe onto myself because my structure is so large relative to the amount of space that I occupy.
But it feels like that's possible to do before you get anything like bacteria.
I think there's a horizon, and I don't know how to articulate this yet. It's a little bit like the horizon at the origin of life, where the space inside a particular structure becomes so large that it has some access to a space that's not, that doesn't feel as physical. It's almost like this idea of counterfactuals. So I think like the past history of your horizon is just much larger than can be encompassed in like a small configuration of matter. So you can like pull this stuff into existence. This property is maybe a continuous property, but there's something really different about human level physical systems and human level ability to understand reality. I really love David Deutsch's conception of universal explainers and that's related to the theory of universal computation. And I think there's some transition that happens there. But maybe to describe that a little bit better, what I can also say is like what intelligence is in this framework. So you have these objects that are large in time. They were selected to exist by constraining the possible space of objects to this particular, like all of the matter is funneled into this particular configuration of object over time. And so these objects arise through selection. But the more selection that you have embedded in you, the more possible selection you have on your future. And so selection and evolution we usually think about in the past sense, where selection happened in the past. But objects that are high density configurations of matter that have a lot of selection in them are also selecting agents in the universe. So they actually embody the physics of selection and they can select on possible futures. And I guess what I'm saying with respect to consciousness and the experience we have is that there's something very deep about that structure and the nature of how we exist in that structure that has to do with how we're navigating that space and how we generate that space and how we continue to persist in that space.
Is there shortcuts we can take to artificially engineering living organisms, artificial life, artificial consciousness, artificial intelligence? So maybe just looking pragmatically at the LLMs we have now, do you think those can exhibit qualities of life, qualities of consciousness, qualities of intelligence in the way we think of intelligence?
I mean, I think they already do, but not in the way I hear popularly discussed. So they're obviously signatures of intelligence and a part of a ecosystem of intelligent systems. But I don't know that individually, I would assign all the properties to them that people have. It's a little like So, we talked about the history of eyes before and like how eyes scaled up into technological forms. And language has also had a really interesting history and got much more interesting, I think, once we started writing it down. And then, in inventing books and things. But like, every time that we started storing language in a new way, where we're kind of existentially traumatized by it. So, like, the idea of written language was traumatic because it seemed like the dead were speaking to us, even though they were deceased. And books were traumatic because, like, suddenly there were lots of copies of this information available to everyone, and it was going to somehow dilute it. And large language models are kind of interesting because they don't feel as static. They're very dynamic. But if you think about language in the way I was describing before, as language is this very large in time structure. And before it had been something that was distributed over human brains as a dynamic structure. And occasionally we store components of that very large dynamic structure in books or in written language. Now we can actually store the dynamics of that structure in a physical artifact, which is a large language model.
Mhm.
And so I think about it almost like the evolution of genomes in some sense, where, there might have been like really primitive genes in the first living things and they didn't store a lot of information, or they were like really messy. And then by the time you get to the eukaryotic cell, you have this really dynamic genetic architecture that's read writable, right? And has all of these different properties. And I think large language models are kind of like the genetic system for language, in some sense, where it's allowing and a sort of archiving that's highly dynamic. And I think it's very paradoxical to us because obviously in human history, we haven't been used to conversing with anything that's not human. Um, but now we can converse basically with a crystallization of human language in a computer. That's a highly dynamic crystal because it's a crystallization in time of this massive abstract structure that's evolved over human history and is now put into a small device.
I think crystallization kind of implies that a limit on its capabilities.
I think there's not, I mean it very purposefully because a particular instantiation of a language model trained on a particular data set becomes a crystal of the
Mm.
language at that time it was trained. But obviously, we're iterating with the technology and evolving it.
I guess the question is, when you crystallize it, when you compress it, when you
Yeah.
archive it, you're archiving some slice of the collective intelligence of the
Yes,
human species.
that's right.
And the question is, like, how powerful is that?
Right. It's a societal level technology, right? We've actually put collective intelligence in a box.
Yeah, I mean, how much smarter is the collective intelligence of humans versus a single human? And
Yeah.
that's the question of AGI versus human level intelligence, superhuman level intelligence versus human level intelligence. Like, how much smarter can this thing, when done well, when we solve a lot of the computation complexities, maybe there's some data complexities, and how to really archive this thing, crystallize this thing really well.
Yeah.
How powerful is this thing going to be? Like, what's your
I think I actually I don't like the sort of language we use around that. And I think the language really matters. So I don't know how to talk about how much smarter one human is than another, right? Like usually we talk about abilities or particular talents someone has. Um, and, going back to, David Deutsch's idea of universal explainers, adopting the view that, uh, we're the first, kinds of structures our biosphere has built that can understand the rest of reality. We have this universal comprehension capability. He makes an argument that basically we're the first things that actually are capable of understanding anything. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean an individual understands everything, but like we have that capability. And so there's not a difference between that and what people talk about with AGI. In some sense, AGI is a universal explainer. But, it might be that a computer is much more efficient at doing, I don't know, prime factorization or something than a human is. But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily smarter or has a broader reach of the kind of things that can understand than a human does. And so I think we really have to think about, is it a level shift, Or is it we're enhancing certain kinds of capabilities humans have in the same way that we can enhanced eyesight by making telescopes and microscopes? Are we enhancing capabilities we have into technologies and the entire global ecosystem is getting more intelligent? Or is it really that we're building some super machine in a box that's going to be smart and kill everybody? Like that sounds like a science, like it's not even a science fiction narrative. It's a bad science fiction narrative. I just don't think it's actually accurate to any of the technologies we're building or the way that we should be describing them. It's not even how we should be describing ourselves.
So the benevolent story is there's a benevolent system that's able to transform our economy, our way of life by just 10xing the GDP of
Well, these are
countries and all that
human
kind
questions, right? I don't think they're necessarily questions that we're going to outsource to an artificial intelligence. I think what is happening and will continue to happen is there's a coevolution between humans and technology that's happening. And we're coexisting in this ecosystem right now, and we're maintaining a lot of the balance. And for the balance to shift to the technology would require some very bad human actors, which is a real risk, or some sort of I don't know, some sort of dynamic that favors I just don't know how that plays out without human agency actually trying to put it in that direction.
It could also be how rapid the rate.
The rapid rate is scary. So I think the things that are, terrifying are the ideas of deep fakes or all the kinds of issues that become legal issues about artificial intelligence technologies, and using them to control weapons or using them for, child pornography or, faking out that someone's, loved one was kidnapped or killed and there's all kinds of things that are super scary in this landscape, and all kinds of new legislation needs to be built, and all kinds of, guardrails on the technology to make sure that people don't abuse it need to be built. And that needs to happen. And I think one function of sort of the artificial intelligence doomsday sort of part of our culture right now is it's sort of our immune response to knowing that's coming. And we're overscaring ourselves, so we try to act more quickly, which is good. But I just, it's about the words that we use versus the actual things happening behind the words. I think one thing that's good is when people are talking about things different ways, it makes us think about them. And also when things are existentially threatening, we want to pay attention to those. But the ways that they're existentially threatening and the ways that we're experiencing existential trauma, I don't think that we're really going to understand for another century or two, if ever. And I certainly think they're not the way that we're describing them now.
Well, creating existential trauma is one of the things that makes life fun, I guess.
Yeah, it's just what we do to ourselves.
It gives us really exciting big problems to solve.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you think we will see these AI systems become conscious or convince us that they're conscious? And then maybe we'll have relationships with them, romantic relationships?
Well, I think people are going to have romantic relationships with them. And I also think that some people would be convinced already that they're conscious. But I think in order, what does it take to convince people that something is conscious? I think that we actually have to have an idea of what we're talking about, that it's we have to have a theory that explains when things are conscious or not, that's testable, right? And we don't have one right now. So I think until we have that, it's always going to be this sort of gray area where some people think it has it and some people think it doesn't, because we don't actually know what we're talking about that we think it has.
So do you think it's possible to get out of the gray area and really have a formal test for consciousness?
For sure.
And for life, as you were...
For sure.
As we've been talking about for something there.
Yeah.
Consciousness is a tricky one.
It is a tricky one. I mean, that's why it's called the hard problem of consciousness, because it's hard. And, it might even be outside of the purview of science, which means that we can't understand it in a scientific way. There might be other ways of coming to understand it, but those may not be the ones that we necessarily want for technological utility, or for developing laws with respect to, because the laws are the things that are going to govern the technology.
Well, I think that's actually where the hard problem of consciousness, a different hard problem of consciousness, is that I fear that humans will resist. That's the last thing they will resist, is calling something else conscious.
Oh, that's interesting. I think it depends on the culture, though, because I mean, some cultures already think like everything's imbued with, a life essence or kind of conscious.
I don't think those cultures have nuclear weapons.
No, they don't. And they're probably not building the most advanced technologies.
The cultures that are primed for destroying the
Mm-hmm.
other, constructing a very effective propaganda machines of what the other is, the group to hate, are the cultures that I worry
Yeah, I know.
would be very resistant to label something,
And so,
to sort of acknowledge the consciousness laden in a thing that was created by us humans.
what do you think the risks are there that the conscious things will get angry with us and fight back?
No, that we would torture and kill conscious beings.
Oh, yeah. I think we do that quite a lot.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, I don't, I mean, it goes back to and I don't know how to feel about this, but, like we talked already about the predator prey thing that, like, in some sense, being alive requires eating other things that are alive. And even if you're a vegetarian or, like try to have you're still eating living things. Yeah.
So maybe part of the story of Earth will involve a predator prey dynamic between humans
That struggle
and
for
human
existence.
creations,
Yeah.
and
No, but
all
I
of that
don't
is part of the
but I don't
technosphere.
like thinking about them as like our technologies as a separate species because this again goes back to this sort of levels of selection issue. And if you think about humans individually alive, you miss the fact that societies are also alive. And so I think about it much more in the sense of an ecosystem is not the right word, but we don't have the right words for these things of like, and this is why I talk about the technosphere. It's a system that is both human and technological. It's not human or technological. Um, and so this is the part that I think we're really good for the like, and this is driving in part a lot of the sort of attitude of like, I'll kill you first with my nuclear weapons. We're really good at identifying things as other. We're not really good at understanding when we're the same or when we're part of an integrated system that's actually functioning together in some kind of cohesive way. So even if you look at like, the division in American politics or something, for example, it's important that there's multiple sides that are arguing with each other because that's actually how you resolve society's issues. It's not like a bad feature. I think like some of the sort of extreme positions and like the way people talk about it are maybe not ideal. But that's how societies solve problems. What it looks like for an individual is really different than the societal level outcomes, and the fact that like there is I don't want to call it cognition or computation. I don't know what you call it, but like there is a process playing out in the dynamics of societies that we are all individual actors in. And like we're not part of that, like it requires all of us acting individually, but like this higher level structure is playing out some things and like things are getting solved for it to be able to maintain itself. And that's the level that our technologies live at. They don't live at our level, they live at the societal level, and they're deeply integrated with the social organism, if you want to call it that. And so I really get upset when people talk about the species of artificial intelligence. I'm like, you mean we live in an ecosystem of all these kind of intelligent things and these animating technologies that were in some sense helping to come alive. We are generating them, but it's not like the biosphere eliminated all of its past history when it invented a new species. All of these things get scaffolded, and we're also augmenting ourselves at the same time that we're building technologies. I don't think we can anticipate what that system's going to look like.
So in some fundamental way, you always want to be thinking about the planet as one organism.
The planet is one living thing.
What happens when it becomes multiplanetary? Is it still just the
Still the same causal chain.
same causal chain?
It's like when the first cell split into two. That's what I was talking about. When a planet reproduces itself, the technosphere emerges enough understanding. It's like this recursive. Like the entire history of life is just recursion, right? So you have an original life event. It evolves for 4 billion years, at least on our planet. It evolves a technosphere. The technologies themselves start to become having this property we call life, which is the phase we're undergoing now. it solves the origin of itself, and then it figures out how that process all works, understands how to make more life, and then can copy itself onto another planet so the whole structure can reproduce itself. And so the origin of life is happening again right now on this planet in the technosphere, with the way that our planet is undergoing another transition, just like at the origin of life when geochemistry transitioned to biology, which is the global, for me, it was a planetary scale transition. It was a multi-scale thing that happened from the scale of chemistry all the way to planetary cycles. It's happening now, all the way from individual humans to the internet, which is a global technology, and all the other things. Like there's this multi-scale process that's happening and transitioning us globally. And it is really like, it's a dramatic transition. It's happening really fast. And we're living in it.
You think this technosphere that we created, this increasingly complex technosphere, will spread to other planets?
I hope so. I think so.
Do you think we'll become a type 2 Kardashev civilization?
I don't really like the Kardashev scale. And it goes back to like, I don't like a lot of the narratives about life because they're very like, survival of the fittest, energy consuming, this, that, and the other thing. It's very like, I don't know, sort of old world, like conqueror mentality.
What's the alternative to that exactly?
I mean, I think it does require life to use new energy sources in order to expand the way it is. So that part's accurate. But I think this sort of process of life like being the mechanism that the universe creatively expresses itself, generates novelty, explores the space of the possible, is really the thing that's most deeply intrinsic to life. And so, these sort of energy consuming scales of technology, I think, is missing the sort of actual feature that's most prominent about any alien life that we might find, which is that it's literally our universe, our reality, trying to creatively express itself and trying to find out what can exist and trying to make it exist.
See, but past a certain level of complexity, unfortunately, maybe you can correct me, but all complex life on Earth is built on a foundation of that predator-prey dynamic.
Yes.
And so, like, I don't know if we can escape that. I don't know.
No, we can't. But this is why I'm okay with having a finite lifetime. And one of the reasons I'm okay with that, actually, goes back to this issue of the fact that we're resource bound. We live in we have a finite amount of material, whatever way you want to define material. I think, like for me, material is time, material is information. But we have a finite amount of material. If time is a generating mechanism, it's always going to be finite because the universe is, it's a resource that's getting generated, but it has a size. Which means that all the things that could exist don't exist. And in fact, most of them never will. So death is a way to make room in the universe for other things to exist that wouldn't be able to exist otherwise. So if the universe over its entire temporal history wants to maximize the number of things, wants is a hard word, maximize a hard word, all these things are approximate, but wants to maximize the number of things that can exist, the best way to do it is to make recursively embedded stacked objects like us that have a lot of structure in a small volume of space, and to have those things turn over rapidly so you can create as many of them as possible.
So there for sure is a bunch of those kinds of things throughout the universe.
Hopefully. Hopefully our universe is teeming with life.